Okay, in this video I'm going to try to explain using a pre-prepared Microsoft Publisher document some of the sort of mysteries behind EDC16 PD injection quantity selection and duration and start of injection. It may well end up as several small videos or one long one, I'm not sure. Depends how bored I get, I guess, and how bored anybody listening gets. I suppose the logical place would be to start with starting the engine. So in other words, if you want to start the engine, you will need a certain amount of injection quantity. So you will need a start injection quantity, and that is usually based on temperature and air pressure. Now the temperatures can be air temperatures, coolant temperatures, fuel temperatures, so there's a variety. And when it comes to air pressure, you've got air pressure as in the base air pressure sensor, or via the manifold absolute pressure sensor, the one that the turbo boost is measured with. So you've got quite a lot of leeway for where the information for that can come from. There are often switches in files to set it to a specific set of conditions, but they will still change though if the ECU thinks there might be a fault or some problem somewhere. But anyway, okay, so that will allow some kind of starting IQ to be selected, and so that starting IQ will be selected, and once you've got that start IQ, and obviously it's got nothing to do with the accelerator pedal, which is why we don't need to touch the accelerator pedal when we start these engines, the engine will start. Now if you've started a cold engine, then this start IQ will be quite a high value compared to if it was a hot engine, but it will still be higher than normal regardless, because it usually uses more fuel to start the engine than it would if the engine was already ticking over. So what we get then, of course, then is the engine starts. Now if the engine is cold, it will automatically default to some kind of high idle speed, and it will be looking at the idle control map, and that map might set at something like 1400 or 1200 revs per minute. You'd have to search each file to see what values these are set at, and then over a period of time or over a period of temperature change, which is more likely, as the engine warms up, the speed will drop. So in other words, the speed or the idle speed will drop until it arrives at whatever the normal value is in the file for that engine. So it might be 850 revs per minute, and obviously we notice that with our cars. We start them and they're cold and the engine might idle a little bit higher, and then as it warms up it drops back to the usual low idle. Now having got to that stage and having got the engine hot, the idle speed is then set by the ECU. So in other words, this is now ignored, and the ECU uses a different set of parameters to set the idle speed. And there are a couple of things going on here. First of all, whatever the idle speed is set at, but mainly this one here, the stationary idle speed, there is a degree of idle speed regulation going on. In other words, injection quantity will be altered to try to keep this idle speed injection quantity at a point where this idle speed doesn't change. So in other words, because the idle speed desired point is 850, there will be constant little fluctuations that are being measured and injection quantity modified slightly to try and make sure that it stays as close to 850 as possible. Now that's the idle speed, let's say, that you would notice if you were just sitting stationary in traffic and not moving anywhere. I've just picked 850 at random. Obviously there are different values for different diesel engines, so I've just picked that one at random. It's not an important number. Now when you're driving, there is a different idle speed involved. In other words, there is what's known as the driving idle speed, and that's often set higher, maybe 950 revs per minute. That is to make sure that if you come to a sudden stop or you're dipping the clutch to change gear, that the idle doesn't drop too low, because this one is usually set at the lowest value the designers could get away with. But if you did that with the driving idle speed, there is always a risk the engine will stall. And so when it comes to the driving idle speed, it's often set a little bit higher, so perhaps 950. So at any given time, you will have the current required idle speed injection quantity, the IQ. And so it could be that one because you're sitting stationary, or it could be this one because you're driving along. But at any given time, you will have an idle speed value. That value doesn't go away, so it doesn't matter whether you are idling or whether you're driving along the road. The idle value, that injection quantity for idle, that remains there all the time. Right, now of course, if you then want to drive away, then most people who have looked at maps and remapping know that there will be a driver's wish map. So when you go to drive away, there will be a driver's wish map in which you select either a desired injection quantity directly or a desired torque, which will then be interpreted through a torque to injection quantity conversion map, and the end result of that will be still an injection quantity. And that is more or less based on the amount of pressure that you're putting down on the accelerator pedal and the revs per minute that you want to get from the engine when you're pushing your foot down on the pedal. So now you end up with a desired injection quantity. Now that desired injection quantity then is two things. It's the information that you've given because you are in control, you're driving, and it's the information the ECU has given that's not under your control, which is all about idle speed. So you've now got this desired driving injection quantity. Now you could look at this and think, oh, that's reasonably complicated, but in fact it's much more complicated than that, because the ECU doesn't just produce this. What it does is it produces lots of variations on this. So in other words, it will produce a smoothed desired driving injection quantity. At the same time, it will produce the original raw data desired injection quantity. So there'll be this one, and there'll be another one, which is the raw data. And then it will also produce one that may include the idle speed, or it may not include the idle speed. In other words, lots of different versions of this are produced inside the ECU for use under different conditions. So you can never be 100% sure at any given moment in time which one of these things the ECU is actually using. But I'm going to assume, for want of any other reason, I'm just going to assume that we've got driver's wish map, we've converted that into an injection quantity, we've got the current idle speed quantity. I'm going to assume it's the one that's going to kick in if I suddenly put my foot on the brake or if I change gear. And so I'm going to assume that that is giving me my desired driving injection quantity. So that's where I arrive at my desired quantity. Now lots of people obviously think it's just this, just the driver's wish map. But as you can see from this, it's not just the driver's wish map. And in fact, with EDC16 files, it's not even one driver's wish map. It's often a selection of driver's wish maps with factors affecting where on the map you will be or which map you will be using. So it gets even more complicated, but I'm not going to go into that. Right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there and do the next bit on another video, simply because I want to keep these short, because otherwise you are going to get bored out of your mind listening to them.